All right, let's dive right into some pretty heavy geopolitical analysis.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one.
We're talking about this meeting between the presidents of the U.S. and Ukraine, and
Right.
and this perspective we're going to be looking at is
It's quite different.
it's pretty out there.
It is. It challenges a lot of the kind of the accepted narratives that we see in mainstream media.
Yeah, so we're going to jump right into this.
Okay.
This analysis actually claims that Ukraine under Zelensky is on a path of national suicide. I mean, those are some
That's a bold statement.
strong words.
To understand why this is being said, we have to, I think, look at the history between Ukraine and Russia and how the West has influenced the current political landscape of Ukraine.
Okay, so context is really important here because this analysis suggests that Zelensky's government is driven by a specific ideology and even labels it as white supremacy.
Yeah, no, that's a very loaded term, obviously.
Right.
And we need to break down what they mean by this. They're arguing that this ideology essentially promotes a sense of exclusion and supremacy. They draw parallels to like historical instances of racism and colonialism. And they suggest that the political landscape in Ukraine is really heavily influenced by this ideology, which has led to its current predicament.
So they're saying that Zelensky himself is like just a symptom of a larger problem.
Yeah, they call it a flawed national construct.
A flawed national...
Meaning that...
What does that even mean?
Well, they're basically arguing that Ukraine as a nation is kind of an artificial creation, a product of manipulation and historical accidents. So they're suggesting that this flawed foundation, coupled with the influence of the U.S. and Europe, has created this very volatile and dangerous situation.
So they're saying that the U.S. and Europe are actually like partially responsible for shaping what's happening in Ukraine right now.
Yeah, they argue that Western powers, maybe not intentionally, have created a Frankenstein's monster by interfering in Ukraine's internal affairs and promoting certain ideologies. And they point to specific events in history and figures to support this claim.
Okay, and they don't stop there. They go on to call Europe a diseased continent.
Yeah.
Saying that it's prone to conflict and basically incapable of peace.
That is quite different from what we usually hear.
It is. It's a very different take.
You know, the idea of European cooperation, EU, all of that, they're asking us to consider this alternate view of Europe as historically warmongering. Is there any merit to this?
Yeah.
They point to centuries of conflict on the continent as evidence.
So essentially what they're saying is Europe bad.
Well,
Ukraine bad.
They are flawed, yes.
And they've dragged the U.S. into this.
That's the essence of it.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
They praise President Trump for trying to break free of this.
Really?
Yes.
They see him as like a positive force in all this.
They do. They see him as a disruptor who is actively dismantling what they call the military-industrial complex.
Okay, so this is like the idea that there's this whole system that profits off of war and conflict.
Exactly. And it drives U.S. foreign policy.
They're saying Trump is like
trying to dismantle
breaking it down.
They even give examples like cuts to USAI, and National Endowment for Democracy, even the Pentagon budget.
Wow.
As evidence that Trump is committed to reducing U.S. military engagement around the world.
So is this analysis saying that Trump is like a peacemaker?
That's a good question.
Or are there other things going on here?
Right. Is this truly a desire for peace? Or are there other motivations? Political calculations, perhaps. Economic interests. A desire to reshape global power.
Yeah, because they also say that the U.S. is going to unplug from Europe.
They do. They predict that the U.S. will eventually unplug from Europe.
And what does that even look like?
Well, it's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
I mean, what happens to NATO? What happens to the EU? The transatlantic partnership?
Decades of alliances.
Right.
Would this lead to a more multipolar world?
Or would it just create a power vacuum?
And who would fill that vacuum?
Exactly.
They actually predict that a new world order will emerge.
They do.
With the U.S., Russia, China, and India forming a new Big Four.
It's a bold prediction.
It is.
It makes us think about how power is shifting globally.
Yeah.
Is there evidence for this? What are the risks? It's a lot to think about.
What's interesting is that they end on a kind of hopeful note.
A little bit, yeah.
They suggest that this new world order could be based on economic cooperation. not military might.
Yeah, so instead of military dominance, they're saying this could be a move towards economic cooperation.
Right.
It raises the question, is it even possible to build a more humane system of international relations?
Right. So this analysis throws out a lot of really unconventional ideas.
It does.
And makes us question some fundamental assumptions about the world.
It makes you think.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. It really does make you kind of rethink things.
And what I thought was really interesting was their take on the actual meeting between Zelensky and Trump.
Right.
They call it a fiasco.
Mm.
And they say it was almost inevitable given the clash of worldviews.
Right.
So they're basically saying that Zelensky, with this ideology that they're ascribing to him, is essentially a pawn in a larger game being played by the West.
Yeah, orchestrated by
Europe and the U.S.
Europe and the U.S., right.
And they see Trump as trying to dismantle that entire system.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's trying to break down this military-industrial complex.
Yes, they see him as trying to extricate the U.S. from this cycle of endless conflict.
But will he be successful? I mean,
And that's the question, isn't it?
that's the big question.
Yeah.
They also say that the Democrats' reaction to all of this was hysterical,
Yeah, they're pretty critical of the Democrats.
saying that they're more concerned with maintaining their power and their sources of funding than any sort of moral high ground.
Yeah, they're saying that the Democrats are so entrenched in this system that they benefit from the flow of money
Right.
that fuels the whole military-industrial complex.
So this is a pretty scathing critique of the entire political establishment.
It is.
But what happens next? What do they say happens if the U.S. actually unplugs from Europe?
Well, they predict that Euros would essentially collapse without American support.
Really?
Yeah, they say it would become more of a tourist destination than a global power.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that the U.S. would then form this new alliance with Russia, China, and India
Right, the big four.
and dominate the 21st century.
That's their vision.
It's a very different world.
It is.
What's interesting is they frame this new world order as a potential turning point,
Yeah.
like a shift away from military dominance toward economic cooperation.
Yeah, they suggest it could even lead to a more humane approach to global affairs.
But is that really possible? Can countries with such different histories and ideologies actually cooperate like that?
That's a good question.
It's a big question.
It is. They acknowledge the challenges.
Yeah.
But they seem to believe that the potential benefits
Right.
outweigh the risks.
Peace and prosperity, basically.
Right. A more peaceful and prosperous world.
I guess we'll have to wait and see if their predictions come true.
We will.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about, though.
A lot to think about.
It really challenges us to think about how we understand the world.
It does. It encourages us to look beyond the headlines
Yeah.
and consider these deeper forces that are at play.
And maybe even our own role in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you wonder what's coming next.
It really does.
It's like we're on the edge of something big.
Yeah, a lot of uncertainty.
But they seem to think that change is possible.
Yeah, even if it gets a little messy along the way.
And they definitely don't hold back on the criticism for anyone who resists this new world order they're talking about.
Right. They're especially critical of the U.S. political system.
Yeah.
Anyone they see is clinging to old ideas.
The old guard.
Yeah, and benefiting from the way things are right now.
Because they're calling for a total revolution.
Yeah, a complete overhaul of how we do things on a global scale.
I mean, they really want to shift mindsets away from this.
This kind of militaristic approach to foreign policy.
Yeah, it's like they think force is always the answer.
It's the go-to solution.
And they seem to think that
Trump's the one.
even with all his,
His unconventional ways.
yeah,
They see him as the guy to lead this change.
because he's not part of the system.
Right. He's not bound by the traditional power structures.
So he can challenge things.
Exactly.
I don't know. It's a really fascinating perspective.
It is.
But is this new world order they're imagining actually possible?
It's a big question.
Is Trump really the disruptor they think he is?
Yeah. Is this all just wishful thinking?
I mean, these are questions everyone has to answer for themselves.
There's no easy answer.
And the future is always uncertain.
Right. We can never know for sure what's going to happen.
But one thing is for sure, the world is changing.
It is. Things are in flux.
The old ways are disappearing.
It's a time of both danger and opportunity, I think.
Yeah, definitely both.
The decisions we make today will have huge consequences down the road.
Yeah, for generations to come.
It's a pretty heavy thought.
It is. It makes you realize we all have a part to play in this.
Yeah. Even when it feels like we don't.
It's not just about the big players.
We're not just passive observers.
We can choose to be.
But we don't have to be.
We can actually shape the future.
We can build a better world.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
I think it means we need to think critically about the information we're taking in.
Don't just accept things at face value.
Challenge assumptions.
Be open to different perspectives.
The future isn't set in stone.
We create it.
Exactly.
Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.